Good evening and welcome.
All right, Director, let's give it maybe just a couple more minutes. I know this is a voluntary meeting tonight, so not expecting our full crew, but I'm going to give people just a couple of minutes to get home and settled and call in.
It is 6:03. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Of course, this is an optional work session for the Southeast Guiding Coalition members. The session is being recorded as usual, and we will add it to all the information that we have on our website.
Recording in progress.
I want to start off by welcoming you all and thanking you for your active participation in this process. We are so close to the end, to making a decision, to making a recommendation that will go forward. So I do want to appreciate your diligence, your due diligence, all the time and all the effort and all the various ways that you have been supportive and helpful for us. Tonight, like I said, it is an optional session, so we do not expect a whole lot of people, but if we get a whole lot of people, we will definitely appreciate the participation. We will be looking at some of the F-series, and we'll also be discussing some of the nuances that have since surfaced in our last conversations. And we are going to try to see if we can move the needle a little bit more tonight. That said, I do want to also welcome our board members and the members of our community at large. We do have JED Analytics and Brick Architectural Firm with us again tonight. And I will turn over the meeting to Karina from Brick.
Thank you, Dr. O.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Well, welcome again. Thank you so much for being here. Really just want to take a moment to appreciate you and talk a little bit about kind of the community agreements. We always start with our community agreements. To a good reminder, tonight's going to be a little bit more informal than our previous meetings. We're not really going to go into a variety of rooms and have a variety of topics. It really is just trying to have a conversation, right? But still want to remind us that about the agreements that we made, and really as we start to cycle around or start to come together around ideas, and they start to get a little bit more solidified, that's where we really want to try and listen first and then process, and then please share your thoughts and share space with others. So looking forward to a great conversation tonight, and I am going to transfer it to Judy.
Hi, everyone. And some of you have been with us in prior sessions. Thanks for coming back. If this is the first optional session that you've been to this week, thank you for making time. Here's sort of the run of show for the next little while. I'm going to walk you through some information, mostly about our program placement. And then I'm going to turn it over to, if I heard that right, Dr. O, I'm going to turn it over to JED Analytics.
I love that.
Like JED, unfortunately, couldn't make it tonight. Ethan and Jenny are both here as backup, and I'm sure that they will share with them and Tyler Vic that it's now JED Analytics. So this is intended to be for you. We are going to pause frequently for your questions. We're going to invite dialogue around important topics. The whole purpose of this is to help you feel prepared to complete your evaluation. And I think if it's okay, actually, I'm going to, I'm going to jump forward because I'm not sure everybody can stay till the end, and I want to make sure you're aware of where things go from here. So if you could see this, we're looking for your feedback tonight on some key questions about program placements and the ideas that we've shared with you about how to address some boundary changes with 3 different options. And we are open to any ideas that you have and you want to include on that feedback form. Our goal as a planning team is to make some decisions tomorrow about what, if anything, will need to be newly analyzed. And so we've got a lot to do. That's why we're really looking for you to finish tonight if you can, first thing tomorrow morning at the latest, because we've got to give some new directions potentially to Flow, and they're going to have to turn things around quickly. They know that and they're prepared, but that's why we're under this tight time. We'll be sending things back to you, and then that'll help us set the stage for this very important meeting next Thursday on the 17th. Also wanted to make sure that you knew that there's a school board discussion. You know, we do regular check-ins with the school board about the process, and one of those is scheduled for Tuesday, February 15th. Claire, is there anything that you'd like to add about that and how you and the co-chairs are preparing?
So we have a work session with the board for, I think it's scheduled for an hour or 2 hours. I don't remember right in front of me, but it's a time for us to kind of go back to the board, remind them, what did they ask us to do? What is the process that we followed? Where we currently are? What questions they have? And then to give them an opportunity to have a discussion. And so it's a 1 agenda item meeting. It's not a regular board meeting. It's a more informal setting where there can be conversation. And so I'm going to ask some key staff to join me, as well as our co-chairs, to do some presentation to kind of bring them up to date, remembering that some of them, 2 of them are new and weren't on the board when we did phase 1. So really making sure we're adding enough information for them to be up to speed, and that as well as having an opportunity for a dialogue with the board as a whole. Hope that is that kind of what you were hoping for, Judy?
Yeah, and I hope that helps for folks to hear it. And we'll make sure that this is a message, since every SEGC member couldn't be here, and give a special grace to some of our principals who couldn't make it, because, you know, this is an important day when they receive their staffing information. So, and I see that some are in the room, and thank you all for being here. Okay, we also want to make sure that you're aware that there is a volunteer group, and they've begun drafting what will be the framework for your final recommendation. They're going to have information to share with you next week as well. And in the background, we've got targeted engagement that may be going on. We don't have anything scheduled right now that we can share with you, but there's a lot happening. And I guess for this last of our work sessions, I just wanted to sort of begin with that end in mind. And then I'm going to take this off of here. Oh, yeah, and we're done. And get back where we're going. Any questions or comments as I reset? Oops. Okay. Now we've, please go ahead, Elizabeth.
Hi, I was just, you don't have to do this now, but I'm wondering at some point in time, if you haven't already, would you share with us who's on the planning group that's doing the volunteer work? And thank you very much to them all for doing that. And also, who in PPS is doing the drafting of the report for the board?
Sure, let's do that now. If you volunteered to be a writer and you're in the room, would you just wave, say hi so people see you? Speak up. I think I see some here.
Yeah, this is Andy. I'm one of them.
Sarah, are you here? Is Sarah here today? Sarah's
Yes.
on.
I was muted and off, so I had to run back. Hi, yes, I'm one of them.
I don't know.
I don't know if Dee's here.
Is Dee here?
I'm not sure.
Dee has also volunteered. And then we've got our co-chairs who are participating in whatever capacity they can. And there's always room for more. So if you're interested, please contact any of those folks. And then PBS.
Chair, and Adriel's not here tonight, I don't think, but she is planning. She's part of the writing team more than I am. I will be in the review role.
And I support them, and then any other staff that needs to provide technical assistance. You see Lisa Wheeler's here, like if there's things that we need to get specific about regarding transportation, like would anybody on PBS that they need to support will be available. Okay. All right, so we talked about beginning with the end in mind, and now I'm going to take us back to the beginning and just these 3 bullet points to recenter us on the specific students and schools that we are most required to provide a recommendation on. And that is Harrison Park, conversion to a middle school, relocation of the K-5 students, and then increasing enrollment at Lane Middle School. This is also a reminder that there's been quite a bit of engagement along the way. Shanice is working, I think, and we'll have a summary for you that both takes us back to probably more like the ABCs, and when we had a broad survey who responded to that survey, and then the targeted engagement that more intentionally invites the input of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And this is the slide she shared with you last week, but a reminder of the voices and perspectives that we're trying to center, and that you have asked us to assist in doing that, and we're still on it. A key element is program placement, and here are 4 major program decisions that you as a committee have already come to consensus on. That the new location for Harrison Park K-5 will be the Clark Building, and the Chinese DLI program will stay with it. That neighborhood-based program will stay with the neighborhood. That is a very important part of the recommendation, and it locks in a certain aspect of other things that, such as the fact that then the creative science building program needs to change. You looked at a number of ways of achieving that, and came to consensus around it joining with the Bridger neighborhood in the Bridger building, where over time with different transfer in rules, they would share the space and hopefully no longer use the modulars. And then another important decision is that Chinese DLI and neighborhood will remain at Woodstock. That was the strongest request that we had from families of in that program, including native Chinese speaking families, that the program is successful, and they ask that it remain where it is. And that is something that you've come to consensus to allow. And then this 4th piece is an important one, and it also leads to some of the complexity in getting to the final decision. And that is that where we have multiple DLI programs, such as Spanish and Chinese, you want to see them come together at a single middle school. So you came to consensus on that, and now for the last, weeks and weeks, we've been working on trying to find the best fit to do that and resolve all the feeder pattern and boundary change issues. Before we turn it over for more on the feeder patterns and boundary changes, we just have a slide on each of the program elements that are sort of in a package that you've had multiple discussions and multiple polls and votes on. The first being Spanish immersion at Lent, where the Bridger program would move. And then the Lent neighborhood students, the neighborhood part of the program, the English scholars part would phase out, and future students would have the opportunity either to all enroll at Lent, so it'd be guaranteed if you live in the Lent neighborhood and you want Spanish immersion, or you would enroll at a nearby school, and it's likely that nearby school would be Marysville. We don't want to say too much specifically until we more deeply engage with the Lent community around that opt-out. Additionally, middle school Spanish immersion would remain at Kellogg, and one more strand would come over to consolidate the whole Southeast program. And the Chinese immersion would be at Harrison Park. So that's the natural feeder for the neighborhood program that's at Harrison Park now. But the two strands from Hosford that feed up from Woodstock would come here. Here's some of the stakeholder input that we've heard along the way for each of these, starting with Lent Spanish immersion. And some of the conditions for success, the caveats that you've raised as vital, both to inform Claire as part of what she takes forward to the board and wants to make sure that the board and the district honor certain things. In this case, you've asked for assurance that transportation and supports would be in place for the Bridger students who are transitioning into Lent, and a lot of questions about how to make it, strong and successful and supportive for Lent neighborhood students who would go to a different school. Just going to pause and say, are there any other elements or pieces about the Lent Spanish immersion that anyone wants to raise at this time? Okay.
Judy, I just want to thank Chair DePass for joining us tonight, and Director Brim Edwards, from both of them, for the board, coming and checking in with us. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have many responsibilities as board members, and I appreciate you coming and hearing things firsthand. Thank you.
Okay. So the next element is middle school Spanish immersion. Again, stakeholder input. We've both heard very strong desire from Spanish immersion programs and from our school principals to keep the program at Kellogg, in part because of the strong work that was done to staff not just the program, but the entire Kellogg school community to be supportive. It was, I think Claire described it a while back as sort of a one-time opportunity to build a whole new staff with that focus, and all of that might not be able to carry over to a new location. On the other hand, we've heard some very significant concerns about the imbalance in enrollment between Kellogg and Harrison Park if we go with this plan, with Kellogg having more than 100 more students, that Kellogg would be crowded beyond what our range of 80% would be. That neighborhood students, including the Creston community, would have to be reassigned elsewhere and possibly more. And in that case, we've heard preference for Spanish immersion moving to Harrison Park. Conditions for success include trying to better shape the Kellogg boundary. And so the F series discussion addresses that in some parts. There's a lot of what we talk about in F that isn't about Kellogg, but a lot of it is too. Anything else about this particular aspect of the program placement that people either have questions about or want to note at this time? All right. You're being quiet and I'm talking too much. So let me get through my part and then hopefully you'll open up. All right, then the third piece is if it's sort of if one program is at Kellogg, then the other is likely to be at Harrison Park. So if Spanish is at Kellogg, then it's Chinese that would be at Harrison Park. We know that the Harrison Park community strongly supports that. We know that the Woodstock community has concerns about distance, and one of the conditions for success is ensuring transportation because it's a further school for many students. There's also a concern that there's a potential change to the Title I status in Harrison Park. And as we've said before, there's a lot of factors that go into into determining Title I status. Enrollment itself is not a factor. It's the proportion of students who qualify for free meals. So there's a lot that's out of our control. but you've seen enough in the numbers that there's a number of people who've raised that as a concern and would want assurances from the district that if this went forward, Harrison Park would be staffed well, even if enrollment was low and there was a change in Title I. And then as just as there was that preference of some to have Spanish immersion at Harrison Park, that preference also goes with Chinese immersion going to Kellogg. That's a brief summary of a lot of very complicated and intense conversations. Anything missing or that you want to add in at this time?
Yeah, so we want to encourage everyone. We know that this is a lot of sort of the point of this is to gain information to allow you to be able to make your evaluation or fill in your evaluation forms. But we want to encourage you all to ask questions, start to poke at some of these ideas. That way we can sort of have a dialogue about that. So anyone that wants to either ask a question or make a comment about what Judy has prepared for us, just raise your hand or open up your mic.
And there is a program comparison that goes with it. It's attached to the PowerPoint. And in this, we just, again, it's an attempt to summarize some of the advantages and disadvantages, who benefits and who's burdened by these different program configurations, and some questions. So those are available to you, and this is a living document, and you are welcome to add to it. Okay. Well, thanks for sitting through that summary. That summary, those program placements are the basis for this series of boundary adjustments that we're calling the F series. And to walk you through the F series, I'm now going to turn it over to Ethan.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. And if you want, I can share my screen, or I'm happy to have you keep sharing. What's out there?
The share is yours.
Oh boy. Okay.
And this means I can chat, so I can start monitoring any questions and others are monitoring the chat too. So you're welcome to put a note in the chat if you've got any questions along the way, or just comments.
Yeah, so as Judy said, the program placements that she just went through are going to be the basis for the F series. And I'll just run through a couple slides, which are hopefully going to kind of shed some light on the differences between the three and sort of how they came to be. And then we can highlight some sort of specific boundary changes that occurred. So F series are based off of program placements, which are found in draft proposal E1, which I think we all looked at probably now a couple weeks ago. And we have feeder patterns here in the graphic. If there are any questions about, or if anyone needs their memory jogged about what exactly those feeder patterns are, in Harrison Park, we have Chinese immersion coming from Clark, Woodstock. We have neighborhood programs coming from Clark, Vestal, and Atkinson. And then we also do have Bridger students who are opting out of Creative Science 6-8. In Kellogg, we have Arleta and Marysville for neighborhood programs, and then Lentz Neighborhood Spanish DLI, and Atkinson's Spanish DLI. And then Creative Science is still remaining at Bridger here as a K-8. So any questions on those program placements or boundary changes so far? Cool. Should be pretty familiar. So it's also important to keep in mind that the only differences between these F series are middle school boundaries. So they're going to have consistent K-5 boundaries, some of which are different from E1, and we're going to go over some of those changes that in a little bit, but some of them are actually ones that you guys have suggested, so hopefully they'll be familiar to you. And I'll go over the differences here, and then we can take a look at the racial equity impact measures, and then answer any questions then. So, and if you have the overview maps, feel free to follow along if you want an interactive activity. Draft proposal F1 is going to have same program placements as E1, but we are going to split the Lewis neighborhood between Lane and Selwood at 45th Avenue, which I believe is right, kind of right at the border of where Lewis sits. And this is going to bump up Lane's enrollment to around 520, and it's going to bump up Selwood's enrollment to 470, and I say up from what it was at E1. So we're basically trying to sort of split the difference between sending all of Lewis to one of the schools. Draft F2 is going to split Arlita's neighborhood between Lane and Kellogg. And we've drawn that boundary at Foster Road. And this is going to shift about 100 students away from Kellogg and put them into Lane, getting Lane an enrollment of 570 and Kellogg an enrollment of 580. So a lot of parity there. And it allows us to keep Lewis in the Selwood feeder, which raises Lewis above that 500 limit. And these first two are exploring split feeders, which is something that is a new concept. We haven't had this before in a proposal, but it is an example of how it allows us to keep K-5 enrollment consistent, and allows us to work kind of purely within the middle school range. Draft proposal F3 is sort of the outlier here because it does not actually split any feeders. It simply takes all of Woodstock's neighborhood and feeds it into Lane instead of Hosford. This allows us to keep Lewis as a feeder to Selwood, which allows us to have Selwood above 500. And this would put Lane's enrollment above 600 and Hosford's enrollment a little bit below 500 at 480. So we can see some of the effects of these in the racial equity impact measures. And for those of you who might have forgotten, these are a set of measures we can use to sort of compare scenarios and draft proposals against each other and also against the baseline. So you can see up here, first one, we have percentage of middle school students who are in a middle school with a greater than 500 enrollment. And then we have percentage of elementary school students who are above that 270 limit. And then sort of in the inverse, we have percentage of students who are in a school that is over 80% capacity utilization. And then finally, we have number of affected students and the percentage of students within 1 mile of their attending school. So looking at these for proposal F1, we can see that this number, this top number here, are you guys able to see my cursor? Is that, yeah, okay, good. We see that this is rather low, and part of that is Selwood being below 500 in our F1 scenario with the split Lewis feeder. It's also important to keep in mind that this is also recording Mount Tabor, which is low, and Roseway Heights, even though those kind of aren't, they're still within our universe. And so they're being recorded here. With F2, we see that we get a little bit more parity amongst middle schools, since we get more middle schools with a higher 50% or 500 enrollment, though it does split that Arlita feeder. And then we see F3 is sort of a little bit in the middle there. Again, we have another middle school falling below the 500 mark, lowering our percentages there. So before we go on, does anyone have any questions about these three proposals, specifically about how the middle school boundaries are laid out. I'm going to go in and start talking about some of the specific changes that have happened to the elementary schools, the K-5s, in just a second. So. No questions?
Can I just clear? So the F series does change all the enrollment numbers for all of the schools that in the area that we're looking at.
It does not change enrollment numbers for Harrison Park, for Mount Tabor significantly. I say that because some, we're not within a closed environment, so some numbers might change incrementally or very small amounts, but our focus here is with the F series, geographically at least, is kind of around the Kellogg Lane boundaries.
But then there are attendant impacts to all of the schools in the catchment area that we're looking at.
Compared to the baseline, yes, since we're going off of E1.
Okay, but okay, thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, I don't know if this helps, but there's sort of 2 degrees of differences in the F series. One is a set of elementary changes that kind of got dialed back and shifted, and Ethan's going to talk about those in a minute. And those primarily impact, well, I think it's that there's some that are in the Atkinson neighborhood, Arleta, Marysville, Whitman, Woodstock, Lewis. Those schools are seeing potential boundary change at the K-5 level. And then on top of that, there's 3 different ways to adjust middle school boundaries, 1, 2, and 3. And those middle school changes affect most, but I don't think they affect Tabor or Harrison Park directly. It's Kellogg, Lane, Hosford, Selwood are the primary places that there's impacts across the middle school pieces.
Yeah, Judy, that's right. There are some changes to the K-5 boundaries. There's some changes around Lent and Marysville, which are going to affect some numbers there. So that kind of does affect the galaxy as a whole.
So I guess my question, because I was looking at E1 as the base, and then the things that you zeroed into on F1, 2, and 3 is the changes from E1. And so that I see Karina nodding her head. Okay, I'm tracking. But then there are other boundary changes that are associated with F1, 2, and 3, and I'm looking for the whole maps of those.
Yeah, so the this is where Ethan maybe it's always chicken or the egg, right? Do you want to see the elementary first or the middle? But they're 2 different layers. So we've walked you through the middle school layer of changes. We haven't walked you through the elementary layer of changes. And they are some differences that impact, that result in different enrollment from E1 to any of the Fs.
Yeah, so that's actually, thank you for the segue, Elizabeth.
I just want to be sure before we move to the elementary that there isn't anyone that has any remaining middle school boundary questions. Okay, you're off to the races, Ethan.
Oh, I'm seeing Chris' hand.
Oh, that's right, Chris. I have to look at your face. What questions do you have, Chris?
I'm sorry, I cannot find the raised hand on my Chromebook.
You are fine.
I need to do more work on that. So this has been confusing me a little bit ever since I saw this particular graph. If one of our primary charges is that everything we do needs to be looked at the lens of what is most beneficial to Black and Native students, all the versions of this on the top, it appears to me that in every case, there are a smaller percentage of that group will be in the schools of the size we hope for at the middle school level. And I understand that's not the only thing we're looking at, but it just feels like a kind of a big thing I just want to point out, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it. but it does seem like we're kind of going backward a little bit for them in this one way.
Appreciate you raising that. I don't think you're misinterpreting it. And I think you're pointing out something that's probably been visible but not discussed. When we are adding middle schools, and some of them, there are more middle schools, there are more students who would be in smaller middle schools in the future, even though more students will be in middle schools, because we're adding Harrison Park as a middle school.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that will change so that means that it's not I guess comparing it to the 2021 baseline then is giving, that's what's confusing me, is it's giving the wrong impression.
Well, and we haven't talked much about Roseway Heights. Roseway Heights is a school in Northeast, and that's where Vestal students go now. And if Vestal students come to Harrison Park, Roseway Heights will have fewer than 500 students in it. It's also adjacent to other K-8 schools that are on track to be converted to K-5 and middle schools in the next round of enrollment balancing. But it's added up in these numbers. So it maybe hasn't gotten attention, but it's part of one of the factors that influences that top blue bar. The other is Mount Tabor, which has so many students now, it looks crowded, but with E or F, it loses Atkinson as a feeder, and it loses the Spanish immersion program, and it even has a little bit of a boundary change that would go to Harrison Park. And those things collectively would put it below 500. It's also adjacent to schools in Northeast that are going to be converted at some point, and so there's future opportunity to address it. But those are all the, there's this world middle schools, some of which we haven't talked about very much, that create that top number.
Great, yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to, it just looked, I don't know, every time I looked at it, I kind of went, oh, shoot, are we really missing out where we're supposed to be? So there's more nuance than it just is shown in that one number. Thank you.
And Chris, I just also want to bring attention to maybe there's fewer changes between baseline and any future proposal in elementary school, where we do see a kind of a marked improvement, especially amongst Black and Native American students. So it's a little, taking both of those into account as well.
So Ethan, as you get ready to move on, I'm just curious, does this bring anything up for folks, this focus on the overall number of small middle schools that is an outcome of E and F as they stand right now? Does that bring anything up for folks that they want to just add into the room? Okay.
I could jump in. Thanks. I don't want to step over you though, Beth, if you want to say, because that is concerning. It is concerning, and I'm hearing that from a lot of families. Like, my question is this something we would be able to address with the K-5 boundary shifts that could potentially, and maybe Ethan, better than that, make up for some of those differences? And then if we are doing that, is that a hardship on all the, then it seems like it might be impacting so many people, once we decide those program placements, but now we're trying to make up the differences for the small middle school enrollments by like chopping up all the K-5s enrollment boundaries. That's just a concern and thoughts that keep coming up.
Thanks, Kathy. And Beth, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was waffling. I think for me, something I'm struggling with all of these is that, we had in our previous meeting before these were produced, we had 2 polls with pretty significantly different results between that were focused on program placement. And so then the decision to go forward with E1 program placements, it felt to me felt to me like that decision between the two was kind of taken away from the coalition, and that E1 was the path for these program placements were the path forward, which is PPS's prerogative. I know that there's a lot of stakeholders you're listening to, but it made me feel like the decision was kind of taken away from us, but then now we're still expected to say, what's your choice from one option, and that it's our decision. So I bring this up because my impression from E2 was that there were more middle schools over 600 or over 500 students, that we had a better balance across the middle school regions. And so I would be curious to see some of these changes that were implemented in the F series to balance things out for Selwood, or other, some other options that had been based off of E2 rather than E1, but it feels like that's not the path we're on with only 1 week left to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I see Andrea Immersion. So glad you're here tonight, Andrea. I'm going to go to you, and then I see Joe might have checked his hand up as well.
Thanks, Judy. So I just want to respond to the question you raised about how does it feel, or what does this bring up? So I'll speak like on an emotional level, I guess, as a participant in this. I think what it feels like is, I don't know if this is a helpful analogy, but I kind of feel like playing a game of whack-a-mole, where like we hit one down and feel like we did it, and then realize, oh no, now it's created this other problem. So on an emotional level, to me, that feels demoralizing, because it feels like, well, if part of the charge, I know the clarity of the board charge around creating middle school at Harrison Park, increasing enrollment at Lane, that makes sense. But we were also asked to hold that with the complexity of trying to think about students as a whole across our region. So to create a situation where we accomplish what the board has asked us to do, but actually create issues at other schools, which impacts students in the region, that doesn't feel good, like just on a gut level, like as somebody participating. So I just wanted to name that when you ask, what does this bring up for us?
Thank you so much.
I wanted to voice, as you know, I'm going through staffing right now and looking at a smaller number of students for the year ahead than what we had previously, is just what that means in terms of programming and making decisions about, okay, can you have like tiered band programs, or how many art classes can you offer, and things like that. That there is definitely an effect on the elective offerings you can have when you go below that number. It's not to say that electives won't exist. It's, you know, the scope of the offerings in different subject areas.
Yeah, that is, thank you. Thank you for, and thank you, Andrea. It's technical, it's practical, it's emotional, it's whack-a-mole. Thank you for that description. All right. So do you think you got one thing settled? Here's the next one popping up. Ethan, will you take us through a series of boundary adjustments from E1, if you can remember what E1 was, and go for it.
Yeah. So I'll go over first some of the changes that we actually made that were suggestions from Southeast Guiding Coalition members, I think on the 20th. And the first one of these is that there was an area, and again, if you have the maps available to you, feel free to follow along. I'll also have the maps later that we can look at and address these, and I have screenshots as well. But we have this area that was going from Marysville to Lent. It was between 82nd and 86th, around Holgate and Foster, and that area has gone back to Marysville. And then an area that was going from Atkinson to Creston is between 52nd and 56th, between Powell and Woodward, back at Atkinson. There was an area south of Woodstock that was extending down from Woodstock to Henry, and we've truncated that a little bit. That area was getting a little bit too close to Lewis, so we've raised that border up to Carlton from Henry. And then an area that was going from Lewis to Whitman has actually expanded. So originally it was the northern boundary of that was Flavel, and now it is Duke. And keeping in mind that these, changes did end up creating some cascading effects, and we'll go over some of the actions we took to sort of balance things out after that. But here's a good visualization of what some of those changes were. You can see this area here is that area that is in Marysville. We had it going to Lent. I think we received some feedback of some specific Native communities in this area that had longstanding ties to Marysville. So it got moved back. This area here in the Atkinson attendance area was being sent to Creston, but there were concerns about crossing 50th, 52nd, Foster, and Powell in order to get to elementary school. So it's back in Atkinson. This is the area that is south of Woodstock. It exists to sort of counterbalance the loss in enrollment that Woodstock gets from giving up its sort of panhandle to Woodmere. But it was approaching down a little bit too close to Lewis, so we've brought it up to Carlton. So this area here that's highlighted is back at Lewis. And then this is the area of Lewis that is going to Whitman that we actually grew. So here's what the change area started off at, and you can see then this red box is going to be the new incorporation. So part of these changes then kind of created some cascading effects. One of the larger ones, and this is actually one that I noticed was not in the slide deck, but I'll bring it to your attention now, was in E1, there was an area right around here that we had going from Creston to Arleta. Creston is a school that really needs enrollment. So, and especially with that area from Atkinson no longer going into Creston, this area got brought back into Creston. But because of that, Arleta ended up needing some enrollment. So we ended up changing this area south of Foster from Marysville. It currently goes to Marysville, and it moves over to Arleta. Another big kind of perennial issue is the location of Kellogg, and needing Kellogg to be within its own attendance area. We can't have a Kellogg in an attendance area that's going to Harrison Park. So we sort of have this area here that was Bridger, and which is now also a K-8 for creative science, and it's now moving into Marysville. So Marysville kind of swoops up and takes some of that over from Bridger. Other highlighted areas to pay attention to are this sort of panhandle of Atkinson in the South Tabor area. This is really, we need a contiguous boundary with Harrison Park, and cutting it at Woodward, which is the current boundary that exists as is, and allowing that sort of, allowing Atkinson to go feed into Harrison Park. And then also these two areas that provide some really much needed enrollment to Whitman. Paying attention to this area here that goes from Woodmere to Whitman. This is pretty much enabled by bringing a lot of enrollment from Woodstock into Woodmere, which then allows us to bring some enrollment from Woodmere into Whitman. So, and that's, any questions about those specific change areas? I've also got the maps that we can look over. I've got stats. I think at this point, Judy, it's pretty much open game.
Sorry, did you say that Woodward boundary was a current boundary? Because I think that entire area down to Powell currently is Bridger, right? Like
it is Bridger, but it is not. It is Harrison Park and then Kellogg split between Bridger.
Oh, I thought that we had kind of informally done that at division last year, but I could be wrong.
So the area between Division and Powell, that part of the Bridger boundary, is technically assigned to Harrison Park. We allowed, the board said, do optional transfers of anyone who lives in that area. They would have priority into Kellogg. So you have to ask for a transfer if you live next door to Kellogg to go to Kellogg. And so this change cleans that issue up. The question is, could all of that area from Division to Powell, could all of it become part of Kellogg? If we do that and Atkinson is part of their pattern, then Atkinson is not contiguous. So this draws the line along Woodward and has north between Woodward and Division join up with Atkinson, and then all of that go together to Harrison Park, and just that section from Woodward to Powell becomes part of Marysville and formally part of Kellogg.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. And this is where, to be clear, it's a full transparency. So I live in South Tabor. I walk along that Woodward line that right there on my walk 3 times a week, right? You can see Kellogg right from the other side of the street. That would be going to, that you could be going to Harrison Park. And so I'm sort of, I get a lot of feedback from my South Tabor neighbors, but I mean, it does, and that's one name. I think this is one of the trade-offs, honestly, of some of the stuff we've locked in this, right? Because Atkinson needs to go to Harrison Park in this scenario, and I totally hear you about the contiguous boundary. I just want to name that is a really arbitrary line across what is really a real neighborhood, and that's, I don't think anyone would say that's ideal, but anyway.
No, I mean, I can't speak for Flo, but I've done this long enough. When we have to produce these things, it's not usually because we think they're ideal. We just keep trying to put out materials to help inspire better solutions. So if there are other ideas or different solutions to this specific issue or any of the others, like, go at it now, guys. This is your room, and start to. I wish we were all sitting around maps with pens. You could, but in a virtual way, if and it's not a challenge as much as really an invitation. So we have tried a lot of different ways to avoid that split. I have a good friend who lives in the area. When I go walk with her, we walk that same place. I know.
I'll say hi to you guys next time I see you.
You probably won't. I can't walk in that area if this goes through.
Micah.
Hi, thanks. Couple of questions. One is, how confident are we of the 2021 enrollment numbers for elementary school? Because I talked to Principal Froelich at Lewis this afternoon, and she said her current enrollment is 340, and it's listed as 274 on these sheets. And also, Whitman's at 261. Not a big problem there, because we're at 261, right? I think they're at 190. So that's number one, right? Number two is, I'm sure it's way easier said than done of closing a school. And no one wants to hear about closing a school, but if I'm just looking at the bunch of school, Woodmere, Marysville, Arleta, Whitman, Kelly, and yes. I'm looking at the one in the middle, which is Woodmere, and we split that up. And then I look at all the other changes we're trying to make. I mean, that cascades to north and west, to us not having to have these wonky boundaries and splitting schools up possibly. So, no one wants to close a school and close and kind of mess up a community, but it may be a big solver without seeing the numbers. And then I also have an issue with the 9 students that are going to Woodstock from Lewis, from that little block of thing. There are a lot of multifamily units going up on Woodstock. I think Woodstock's enrollment will be fine, maybe not in the near future, but kind of close future.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Micah. I think two of those, like one of them, I can just say that when you look at the charts and it says 21-22 enrollment, it's imagining that all of these changes are in effect with the current kids. Okay, so it isn't the kids who are there today. It's imagine, and why don't you go ahead and yeah, go ahead and put up that boundary change area. So Micah, I'd like you to point to exactly which area you had the concern about net kids. Does that make sense to you that the current enrollment isn't today's kids, it's what today's kids would be if these changes were fully in effect? That's what we think the enrollment would be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so to highlight that a little bit more, that would be taking these students here. Sorry, Judy?
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that the definition. Okay, and then can you make sure that you point to the area, because you have the local knowledge that others who are here may not. So what's the area where there's 9 kids that you're concerned would be affected by the boundary change?
Oh, it's in the Lewis to Woodstock 01. I drew out a number, but it's very small, right?
Okay.
And then for middle school, then they have to go all the way up to Hosford too,
Okay.
as well.
So your recommendation is that that area remains assigned, like everything south of Woodstock remains assigned to Lewis?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. That's what I would stress. Thanks.
Thank you. And regarding your comment about closing schools, I'm going to open that up to the room because this has come up in our other meetings as well. And so I invite you all to have some dialogue. How do you feel about, now we know that it's not in the scope or in the charge, but I hear people grappling with it. So.
And I want to honor, Carrie's had her hand up for a while, so I want to honor that as well. Go ahead, Carrie.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm not Beth Kavanaugh or Beth Brett, but I'm the Creston parent. I've been following along, and Beth couldn't be here, so she asked me to come. And I have a question about if we can look at how these boundary changes impact the enrollment of the K-5 schools, and I specifically have a question about the Creston boundary, and I can speak to, I wonder if we can look specifically at that.
Yeah, which do you, I guess actually Creston should be very similar in all of them, so we can pull up. Is there a specific area you wanted to talk about?
There is, yeah. This is an area, and I know this is like sort of not allowed to talk about, but on between Chavez and Holgate, you see that square there that doesn't go to Creston. Yeah, exactly. So those kids go to Grout. They cross. They live within walking distance, like a 5-minute walking distance of Creston. But they go to Grout, they cross Chavez to go to Grout, and a lot of other schools. It's quite a ways away. But and I think this is just to point out to me, like I, as a parent, had a kid who lived down the street from my child. We always met at Creston Park. That is our neighborhood. And when it came time to school, they went to Grout and not to Creston. And it was just one of those things. Like, oh wow, this is really bizarre. Why wouldn't you go to Creston? And here we are adjusting boundaries, and I think, oh, this is the time when PPS is going to fix something like this that's really bizarre, and just I think we could all agree doesn't make sense geographically for that square to go to Grout and not to Creston. And I think this kind of speaks to what I think that I saw Beth, the comment she made in the chat, and what it is that, and I will just reply to Micah too, that you're talking about closing a school. And I think it's it's something that you absolutely shouldn't say very lightly, because we have, it's it deeply impacts the neighborhood to do something like that. I mean, I know that as a Creston parent, we have a lot of friends or people in our community who live in the Richmond neighborhood and have strong memories of when that school was closed and to the neighborhood program there. And I think that what I want to say is that I don't understand how we can even utter the sentence, can we talk about closing a school, when we're not talking about Grout and Abernathy and Dunaway, 3 of our highest enrolled K-5. I just can't believe that we're talking about, and then when looking at a school like Whitman, which is one of our lower SES schools in all of Southeast, and sort of casually throwing out the idea of solving all of our problems by closing that school. And I think that's, you know, we and Llewellyn, yeah, exactly. We really, I don't even think we could have that conversation without pulling in all of those schools and also just pointing out, I know, I'll stop soon here because I know everybody else wants to talk, but I know in the PPS, you know, the greater program meeting that we had with the open house or whatever, the number one question that came up by far among the PPS community was, why are we not taking all of Southeast as a whole, and why are we leaving out the highest SES, whitest schools at K-5s in Southeast Portland? And here we are talking about closing one of our poorer K-5s. I know we're not talking about that, but it's being brought up without mentioning these other schools. That's what I think.
Thank you, Carrie. Andrea.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Carrie said, I appreciate you naming that, Carrie. And I think as a parent of a Whitman student, right, I feel it as the subtext whenever that comes up in the conversation, that it would be the assumption that a school like ours would be on the block for closing. And so it becomes just, I think, a deeply uncomfortable conversation, or at least at this stage of the process.
Thank you for naming that. So anyone, I want to give folks who haven't had a chance to speak, I see your hand up, Andy, and I'll come to you. I want to be sure that everyone who wants to speak that hasn't had a chance to speak has an opportunity. Okay, doesn't look like I'm getting any takers. Okay, Andy, it's all you.
Yeah, I was going to echo, you know, what Andrea and Terry and others have said, and the folks in the chat, and I guess to just add on. So, I mean, I agree with the point that it would seem really inequitable to consider a consolidation when we're limiting ourselves to, like, before we've explored every other option. In this case, there's a very obvious option of doing balancing that includes some of the over-enrolled schools further west. It reminds me, though, of the board discussed this. Gosh, it must be better part of a year ago, right? And this specifically came up. And maybe it was like in the meeting where they were discussing what phase 2 scope should be. And I think this question, Claire put this question on the table, and the consensus was to go ahead with the more limited scope. But I remember that directors, it's either Director Bailey or Director Moore, neither of whom are still on the board, made the point at the time that, like, not only is there the issue that we're talking about, which, like, we're limiting our potential options to balance things out, but we're potentially, as we're seeing, like, setting up a lot of schools at the end of this process to be right on that line of being viable. And even if we don't, there's they're potentially going to be 5 or 10 years from now, you have to come back again, and they're going to be at risk of consolidation or something like that if we don't do a process that includes the schools further west. So it's sort of just delaying the inevitable of either doing a full balancing process or looking at something like consolidation. And so, I mean, I just echo everyone's sentiment that it's an unfortunate situation to be in.
Thank you. Anyone else? So a question that I have is, our program placement decisions between E1 and E2. I don't know, even though we did see some flipping of that, I'm not sure that we are getting to a point where we're really hearing from the Southeast Guiding Coalition a strong consensus around either one of those two options, right? So a question that I have for you all is, think about the one that you, I'm going to say least agree with, or that you have the most problems with. And I want you to share with the rest of the Southeast Guiding Coalition, what are some, I'm going to call them mitigations for lack of a better term, but what are some caveats or mitigations that would make that more palatable for you, right? So if we're starting to say, regardless of whether we end up with E1 or E2, what do you need to make you feel as good about that as you can? What are some, like, you can say, hey, I really like this one as my first one, but I can come on board with this other one if we can do X, Y, and Z. And given everything that you've heard, we can certainly tap into both Judy and Flo's expertise to say, is that even possible, right? But I think it'd be good for us to start to have a conversation around how do we start to bridge that gap. So anyone have any ideas about that?
This is of the F options or of the?
Whichever. I mean, to me, it's really about the program placement, right?
Okay, yeah,
and then
that's what I thought I heard.
Then the derivative F options from there, yeah.
Got it.
Anybody have ideas about that?
I feel like I keep jumping in, but I'm hearing a lot from our families about this. I think with the option of putting all of the DLI at Kellogg, it fills up a lot of space there. And it has impacted us having to significantly change the boundaries for the South Tabor neighborhood and the south of Foster. So that then, we're shifting a large, same thing as walkability, a few blocks from Marysville, but now they'll be moving to Arleta, then to Lane. We'll have to be adding bus transportation to a walkable school, Marysville, that has been walkable forever, but because we'll be above Powell, more, farther away, we'll have to add buses. So there's just a lot of sort of things that have come with that, which may be valid and wonderful, but those are just, I'm hearing a lot from our families that this has been an big impact on movement. And it was a switch from, we saw it in A, and then we didn't see the South losing, switching those boundaries as significantly until F again. So that is what I'm hearing.
Thank you.
I can, thanks for bringing that up, Kathy. And at our session on Monday, there was a discussion, and Ethan, I don't know if you want to put a map back up. We'd be interested in anyone who's in this room to take a look at it and give your feedback. But what came up was when you look at all that series of boundary changes, that there's the Bridger area that goes down into Marysville, and then there's a lot of Marysville that goes into Arleta. And that what was discussed was, would it make more sense for the Bridger area to move between Arleta and Marysville, and then less of Marysville would need to go to Arleta. And so overall, you would achieve pretty much the same thing, but you would affect fewer students. So if you were to sort of, and it's more division in a community that's already being impacted by a lot of changes. Yeah. So Ethan, that's about, so when you see the pink hash marked up at the top there, instead of all of that going to Marysville, some of it goes to Arleta, and then the part that's Marysville below Foster, maybe not all of that would need to move. Am I saying that the right way, Ethan?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's definitely one way you could do it. And I think we've explored that before in, I want to say D or C. I'd have to go back and double check, but where we basically had a straight line more or less between Marysville and Arleta, and they kind of form two squares or two rectangles parallel to each other.
Yeah, and I think that what the tension, there's tension, right, in trying to get to what's closest and what's the best number, and like how many kids you want to and communities you want to cause change to. And so one of the things that this would do is have fewer kids in having to move in or out of Marysville and Arleta, I think. Just wanted you to know that that was part of the conversation. I see in the chat that this, I'm hearing, this topic of the limitation on the western side of the line, the fact that the board consented and affirmed that that we shouldn't go all the way to the river has been a sore for folks as part of this process. And I don't know that we attend to it today, but I want to respect that, and I want maybe you guys to take some time to think about, like, how do you want to deal with that in terms of what you're recommending that ultimately does go back to the board. And I know your writing team also is like listening keenly and cares about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And Beth's hand is up.
So a question I have about, like, I'm thinking about that that proposed shift in the Arleta-Marysville boundary, and I understand that that brings it closer to the current boundary, which means less transition for the current students. A question I have, I know one of the things we're asked to think about in our recommendation, and that's ultimately the board's decision, is about the transition process and whether it applies to current students or only new incoming students or only up to third grade or whatever it might be. And I wonder, like, is that straight line where kids are crossing Powell to both Arleta and Marysville, is that the safest and most, would be the most positive boundary in the communities if it weren't for this transition piece? Because that's something that we could think about too. If it's like, well, really, it feels less safe for somebody to have to cross Powell and Holgate and Foster to get to Arleta. And maybe it would be better if all of these kids are going to Marysville in the long term. But if we have a transition period so that the current students are not impacted by that change and they sort of stay, so it's shifting over time between those two. I don't know. My question is that the best long-term solution, or is it the best for the immediate students right now? And I don't know the answer because that's not my neighborhood, but just want to think about that.
I see Dee's hand up. Go ahead, Dee. And I'm not sure I see everybody, so, but I think it's Dee.
Yeah, it is. Dee's hand is up and I don't see anyone else.
I have kind of and I'm sorry, it feels like a question I should have asked a long time ago. I think for those of us who don't work in sort of like schools and this level, I think there's just some things that are a little confusing as we kind of talk through like boundaries and equity and all of these things. And so I'm just wondering if either someone from the district or Beth or Adriel, someone who's got like more experience in this field, like, it feels like, I kind of had a chance to dive into some of the numbers from last week, and just looking at like the staffing at Lane versus the staffing at Mount Tabor versus the number of students, and just kind of looking at all those numbers, it feels like a big piece of what we're trying to accomplish. It feels like we're trying to accomplish some equity goals, moving boundaries and programs. And when you look at the FTEs and the performance of the schools, it doesn't feel like school size or number of FTEs or any of those things actually affects like what you would consider to be school performance or closing performance gaps. It feels like the sort of like elephant in the room is that, schools in poorer neighborhoods and neighborhoods that have more kids of color generally just don't perform as well. And it doesn't seem like, if the school is bigger, it doesn't seem like it helps. If the school is smaller, it doesn't seem like it helps. It seems like big schools that have good performance records in nicer neighborhoods do well and other schools don't. And I'm just curious, like, this seems like a lot, like, how are these gaps going to be filled just by moving boundaries and kids around? Like, look, I mean, this just seems like it's causing so much stress and trauma. It started out with the DLI programs and now it's everybody. And I just would like to hear a little bit more about, like, there's an assumption that if we get more numbers in certain places, that's going to help. But then when we talk about to those individual school communities about what it looks like to move those numbers around, like nobody likes it. No, like the move doesn't seem positive, the net result doesn't seem positive. And so it would be nice if somebody could just maybe recenter for us, like where it seems like a lot of educational theory and we're moving a lot of people around and it's causing a lot of stress. And so I guess I'd like to see a clearer correlation between the purpose of the movement and the outcome. If somebody has that.
I mean, I can
and,
say
and world peace too. So.
I can talk about my just my understanding, but I don't know if it makes more sense to have a PPS staff person speak to this first.
Sure. I mean, I'll take a run at it. There are a couple of pieces. School size in and of itself is not a predictor of student success, right? Like, so there may be some correlations about some things, but it's not going to be the predictor. So I think that what you're hearing is trying to, I think back to the conversation, the comments that Principal Rowell had shared when we were having quite a bit of a conversation about the number of students at Harrison Park, right? Like, and comparing the difference between Harrison Park and Kellogg, for example. And I think that what it does is there is the focus is around continuity of programming, right? And also it's really which provides some stability. So stability and continuity of programming is part of what is, and predictability is part of what the what enrollment balancing can help support, right, at a school. So I think that what you're sensing is the trade-off, some of those trade-offs. It becomes fairly complicated when we talk about what are the programs, like when we talk about immersion and whatnot, that are actually residing within a building. But that's the general notion about sort of like an enrollment piece. What happens within the classrooms, within the school, the culture, those pieces, is obviously the part in the teaching and learning and the instructional, right, is where we see highest leverage with changes to student outcomes. And so that's enrollment balancing is one of many, right? Like, I appreciate the question of like where is the highest leverage and like what is that? But I think that the biggest thing that I would say is that continuity of program stability comes with some modicum of size, and I think that's really what people are talking about. And so that's sort of the thrust, I would say. And then I guess the other piece is that when we're looking, and I've heard this a number of times, is it looks slightly different in elementary, but what I heard a lot about was like the middle school program offerings, right? The course offerings, right? And so like, how do you have enrichment and support and at the same time? And so again, these are the things that the structure of it helps support the things, but really it's what happens within the classrooms. Obviously it's going to be the highest piece, but the stability and that sense of not being on the edge of having things come and go is probably really what I think that's really the trick of what this is. And I think you guys are wrestling with all of the hard issues, right? So you can start to make it, I don't know if it's whack-a-mole, but certainly it's as you try to solve one problem, something else kind of pops up. And so you're trying to balance those trade-offs. And so, I'm appreciating the conversation because you guys are wrestling with some pretty tough notions for sure. So I don't know if that's helpful, Dee, but that's.
Yeah, no, really, thank you. It's just, I feel like we spin our wheels so much that it's nice to just have a little bit of refocusing on like where we're coming from all the pieces. It's like we've got the tool and we keep trying to use the tool, and I think I've forgotten what some of the tools are for, so it was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess sorry, there's just one other thing that I would add, and that is, and the reality is that for some of our schools that have lower enrollment, they are serving some of our predominantly students of color and families of color. And so because of that, it creates some instability. And so we're like, so that's the sort of racial equity lever. I don't know if the lever is the right word, but the action that is helpful to think through is like, how do we create those things and really look at the pieces of how does that support stability of programming.
Thanks, Margaret. Before we get to, I know other members of the SCGC have questions, but Dr. O, is there anything you want to add from PPS's perspective here? You're on mute.
Yes.
If you are.
Yes, what I wanted to add is I'm a little bit concerned about, the back and forth that we've been doing through this whole process. And the reason is because it seems like if we make a decision now, there is a likelihood that that decision will be impacted by something else down the road. So, which means that we're shifting people or bodies or families twice over. And that almost happened in this scenario with Alita. So that's my worry about the decisions we're making, because this whole Southeast Guiding Coalition process, eventually it is going to affect every school in the district, right? Because we're right sizing, we just chose to start with Southeast. As we travel through, I don't know which quadrant we're going to go to next, but as we move through the quadrants, the likelihood that other schools that were impacted now will be impacted again. So how do we mitigate for those concerns, and how do we make sure that we are not, displacing people over and over again? I have also spoken to some of my principals who have said this has been the practice. Communities of color get displaced over and over again, and there's just an issue with that. It's one thing for them to be underserved; it's an entirely different thing to be displaced repeatedly. So that's my concern as we wrestle with these conversations.
Yeah. And I want to encourage voices that we haven't heard from. We really want to try and expand the circle of what voices we're getting into the room. So even if it's in the chat, we really want to hear from you all. In the interim, oh, go ahead.
Hi, it's Chair DePass.
Hey, Michelle.
I've been off camera. I'm very, very tired, just like hanging on to the last thread today. But I wanted to just thank everybody for sticking with the process. And just to let you know that I'm here and I'm listening, like barely functioning right now, but I'm listening. I really, Dr. O, what you said about displacement is if you have a family background of immigration or having been displaced, it usually doesn't happen just one time, it's multiple times, and that trauma is cumulative. And my reason for even being here tonight is to try to assure that displacement doesn't happen over and over and over again, because I understand what that trauma can do for students, and just a huge heart for the students, for instance, at Harrison Park, that I know come from refugee camps, from very tough situations, and just want to encourage all of us to try to think about the broader community, and it's hard to think about not beyond your own children, right? And your own children only have one chance to be successful. But if your children have a little bit of a head up, a two-parent family, a stable home ownership, I'm really going to ask people to be compassionate about those that we want to serve. And that's because it reflects on who we are as a community, on how we take care of those people that don't have as much. And so I'm here because I care about those people that don't have as much, that are resilient over and over again. And I just encourage us to think about the broader community if we can. I know it's difficult. I've been in decision making myself where you're thinking, well, my kids are going to suffer, but I really just want to encourage us to stick with the process and stick with the solutions that we know will benefit those kids who are much more vulnerable, don't speak English, are learning how to use electrical outlets, washing machines here, etc. So thank you. And I'll go back off camera again. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair DePass.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have questions, thoughts? Thank you, Sam. Yeah, Eddie.
Yeah, again, that was thank you for saying that. That was very coherent for being on your last thread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I that's why I think this issue of like opening up the inner southeast schools is important, because if we don't and they overcrowd and they start pouring eastward, that means we're gonna, I mean, what, 5 years have to do this again for the poorest communities that we're serving. And if we can't do that, and I want to be a realist here, like I think no one has the energy to go back and start this whole process over. You're insane if you want to. Is there a way that we could maybe adjust the enrollment so that there's, I don't know how to describe it, maybe like buffer schools, like for example, slightly under-enroll the middle southeast schools like Woodstock, I'm sacrificing my school, or others that can take slight ups and downs, so that if we do need to adjust the boundaries, the schools to the east don't have to suffer to change again. That's just something something that's top of my head. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for trying to think outside the box, Eddie. Elizabeth, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for those comments, and Dr. Owen. I think that when I'm trying to look at this and figure out, okay, how do I center racial equity in this evaluation? I'm looking at the tools that I have. And what I'm hearing at this stage of the process, it really is about enrollment numbers and making sure that, and I'm looking at the racial equity impact, and that's one tool. And then the other tool that I have is just looking at the maps and saying, okay, who's being impacted where and who's being asked to move. And I think we all just talked about that. And I want to make sure that there's nothing else that I could be taking advantage of that would help me evaluate the racial equity impacts at this particular moment.
Well, we've also collected and heard from people directly. And as a reminder, and Megan, if you're here, and maybe even put in the chat, the summaries of the notes from the Black and Indigenous people of color, the listening sessions that have been going on since September, both framing what people need and hope for their children, and specific reactions to different elements as they've been available. So I would strongly encourage, it is like 3 legs of a stool, Elizabeth. I appreciate how you described that. And that third leg, and maybe the one that if you have to lean the most, lean into how do you know whose benefits and whose burden? Who have you heard from?
Thank you. And then the second, maybe it's a suggestion, but every time you do pull a thread, you affect the fabric of the whole. And I wonder if it's helpful for PBS if we just, when we fill out our forms, we tell you what our priorities are too, right? So I can tell you that, my priority is racial equity impacts. And then I think boundaries are important, but they're less important than the first, right? Because, as I hear this conversation, we keep going back and forth with stuff because something will give. At some point, we will not get everything we want. So does it help you with your decision making if you tell you what are the things that we feel like we don't want to give up on?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Elizabeth. Thank you for that. I know one of the things that while we have the summary, hearing from some of the most impacted families, the ones that are, really kind of wrestling with this between the Harrison Park and Kellogg communities, is hearing from them directly. And so Leah and I were chatting offline to see if she wouldn't be willing to share some of the feedback that she's heard in her building about what their priorities are. So I'll turn it over to you, Principal Dickey.
Thank you. Sorry, I apologize. I had to actually make a call in regards to work today. So we are, continually in checking in, and I've really made it a point to try to check in with our BIPOC families as much as possible, and especially those families where English may not be their first language, and have more of those just one-to-one phone conversations. And some of that has been done with staff members that they trust, and they've come to, be able to really talk openly. And I think always keeping in mind that for many of our cultures, there is some differences in terms of when we ask them, what input do you want to give to the school? There is just an extreme amount of trust in us. And so a lot of times we'll get whatever you want, whatever you think is best. You're the experts. And we have to really keep working on, okay, we are the experts sometimes, not always, definitely not always, but, trying to say, but we want to make sure that we're doing what is best for your family, and what are some concerns and things that you think about. And again, time and time again, from my community, it is that they want their kids to remain in an environment where it is, diverse, that they, even with the struggles, sometimes with some racial tension and those types of things, our families appreciate that their students go to a school where students, there is so many different students that they feel like there is somebody like them most of the time. And so that's been something that they've voiced. The other piece is a lot of my families have really voiced that there is academic supports. I know we've had a lot of, talk about electives and those types of things, which I think are very, very important. But many of my families, especially those families that are where students are still mastering the English language, they are saying, I want my student to ensure that they have academic supports and that they catch up. And so that's something really, really important to them. And so when we start having that conversation, like last week with funding and those, losing title funding, I think that that's really important to remember, because that is something we do have to think of as we go through this process. And I think it will be very isolating if we have a lot of our families that, they don't see that diversity, and that will be a big shift. And there'll be a lot of work on everybody's part to ensure that those families are brought in. So that's been the biggest feedback, is just they want to ensure that their kids get the academic support that they need, and that they're as close to home as possible. They just keep wanting, they'll say, I want it to remain as it is. And that change and that shift is hard, because they had to come here and learn our way, and, kind of how things are. And they're comfortable with that. And so just any kind of shift is going to be a lot of work for them. And yeah, so that's kind of what I've just heard over and over again. Thanks.
Thank you, Leah, for sharing. Misha.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I was thinking what's missing or has been brought up but hasn't been directly spoken a lot about is part of the equity piece is ensuring that every school, no matter where you live, has quality education for our kids. Like top of the line, you don't have to worry that your kids may be missing out on something if you go to a different school. I know it's a part, I don't know, I just think it's a part of the conversation for sure. And right now, just in the Office of Teaching and Learning, part of the strategic plan is to have an instructional framework. And so that step for us in the office is really going to help think about, what does excellent instruction look like? What does excellent supports look like? Not for some schools that may have title or may have extra funding from parents, but what does it look like for all of our schools? And what do we need to do to make sure that all of our kids are learning, and especially our Black and Brown and Native students? So I realize that, and since I've transitioned from being a principal to this new role in the district office, like I just see how important it is that it doesn't matter where our kids go, that they get what they deserve through strong instruction.
Thanks, Misha.
And Misha, that kind of brings up something that I also wanted to mention, because I think last week's discussion around also understanding through this process, when we start looking at different buildings and middle schools, or, that we have to really look at the population that building is serving, and understand that every building has their own culture. And sometimes when we're looking at, I'll just use band as an example.
that may not be what the students and the families in that particular building find important, and it may be the majority, right? And so we have to start looking at that, because that hasn't been something my parents have pushed for. And so when we start bringing these communities together, everybody has to understand we're all going to have to come up with some, commonality, that maybe having, a really, really strong band program isn't something, but having a really strong choir program is something that we want to ensure that we have, because there's more interest there, and really listening to the students and the families about what is it that they want, and understanding that every place may have some differences in some ways, but like you said, it's that strong core quality instruction that has to be common everywhere.
Yeah, and part of the middle school redesign process, I know we haven't spoke a lot about it, but is that empathy. I'm using design thinking to go through the process, like collecting, so working with schools, and they're collecting empathy data, or having interviews, right, with their families and their kids to say, these are the changes that we see, but are they actually what the students are saying we need, and the families. So it is specific to the context and culture of each school, and then thinking about what works for some schools, and then how does that look for the broader system and for all middle schools, knowing that some things may be a good fit for some, and some we won't work, at another school. So thanks for bringing that up, Leah.
Okay. Michelle. You're on mute, Michelle.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm a Harrison Park parent, and I just wanted to bring up that we are moving Atkinson and Woodstock families into our very diverse population. And so you're bringing in like a wider, more affluent group of students, and how will that affect the current student body that we have now? I think it will affect our Title I status as well. Like, we may see attrition from families that can afford like a private school or to go to a different school in Southeast. So I would like to see us look at enrollment and how to, like, sort of guarantee a good enrollment size if we're going to do E1. And with the F series, I'm seeing like more movement into lane, which is one of the things we're hoping to do, but I'm seeing less of like how to boost Harrison Park student enrollment and decrease enrollment at Kellogg. So.
Thank you for sharing, Michelle. Okay, does anyone else have anything that you need to better equip you to fill out your evaluation form? Is there another piece of information that you're looking for? We know that that is the task that is before you tonight. So we also want to honor that and give you some time to be able to do that before our meeting ends here at 9. But want to ensure that there isn't productive conversation that we can have moving forward, right? That there aren't questions that we can answer, information that you need. So I want to open that up to the room. Eddie.
Yeah, this might be a question for Leah. So Harrison Park converting to 6-8 means that there's going to be a lot of hiring opportunities, correct? I mean, because I imagine that teachers are either middle or elementary certified, usually not both. So with the opportunities of opening a new 6-8, I mean, it'd just be nice to know this to kind of help balance out where we're deciding on putting students. Is there going to be, it seems like from your experience, would you be able to see like opportunities for kind of like what Kellogg had, which is, being able to hire from the ground up again. Not totally, of course, but at least some opportunities. Like, I don't know if there's anything about that you might be able to share, or anybody.
Yeah, I can speak to it a bit. We have middle school staff. I imagine and I haven't been through this process before, but I imagine because we're not combining with another middle school program, right? There's not another middle school that we have to bring two staffs together, and that would be a little bit different. That there will be quite a bit of hiring, and I can speak to the staff that I have right now. We've done a lot of work, and we've come a long way with our middle school, and that's been a real big focus. But I also know that really looking at in the hiring. When you're hiring, is who is going to do the best job with the people that they're serving and the students that are sitting right in front of them. And I think that has the biggest impact. And ensuring that as you're planning and you're putting things together, that you really, really sit and think about doing that in a articulated way, and that you are mindful about building that culture. And there's just a lot of work to that, but I think we will have the opportunity to do a lot of hiring, just because a good chunk of my staff is K5, right? So I do foresee that it will be a big hiring situation.
Well, and I believe it's true that the teachers who might be unassigned from their current location would have priority, but it's a complicated process. Seniority, licensure, all of those things come into play. And so it isn't a blank slate. I mean, there's the positive aspect of staff moving with the students, but there's many steps in the process. And it's not as linear as you might expect. And the principal hiring manager gets to bring those best thoughts, right? As Leah, really appreciate you describing what you look for and when you're trying to build that staff. And I'm sure you're excited and wish that was happening right now instead of a year from now.
I definitely, and I'm a baseball fan, so I will, I'm looking for utility players, people that can do many different things to help bring a well-rounded and, if a lot of times that's, especially when you're looking at smaller schools like mine, the hiring we've done is really to look at, okay, this person can teach this and they can teach this, and really looking for somebody that has a lot of skills that they can bring.
Yeah, I guess part of the reason I bring that up is because I hate to kind of go down this route, but I have a preference to try to do as much as we can to keep Spanish DLI at Kellogg. That being said, I felt like it was a little bit backwards the way it worked, in that the parameter for we can't move the staff at Kellogg, period, and that's what we have to work with. But instead of actually truly exploring, hey, these are schools, these are the ones that are opening, and here are the hiring options, and then comparing the actual real data, oh yeah, if you try to move it from Kellogg, then maybe only 50% would be able to move over. Are we talking about 2 staff versus 20? We don't even know how many number of people at Kellogg were hired for that. I mean, that being said, it's not this is again, I'm just saying this is not my preference, but I'm just saying is that it would have been nice to kind of work from the data first and what we're actually dealing with versus it seems like there's a lot of things that were kind of put on us, and then we had to decide, among the leftovers almost. Anyways, I'm just voicing my frustration with that early part of that process. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Okay, so I want to go back to the question. Anything you need, anything further that will help you in being able to fill out your evaluation? Sandra, good to see you.
I'm just wondering if this may be something that's been provided to us already and it's just close to the bottom of my electronic stack. But I'm wondering about a full district-wide capacity, like enrollment numbers,
Having a very hard time hearing you, Sandra. Can you try that one more time for us?
Oh, sure. Sure.
Bluetooth disconnect. I'm sorry. Is that
Perfect?
here?
That's
Is
perfect.
this better? Can you hear me
Much
better?
better, yes.
So I think it's my car Bluetooth. I'm majorly multitasking. I apologize.
All right. Well, be safe first of all.
Well, I'm stopped now. So my question was just, I'm wondering about enrollment and capacity numbers, sort of district wide. If I tell you, I'm looking for an end result for is like what the capacities are looking like for those, so I can compare them to the capacity numbers that we're looking at in our proposals. And I recognize that may be information that is somewhere in what has been provided to us.
Judy, did you get enough of that to be able to?
Oh, I'm
answer?
so sorry, Sandra. I was like keenly trying to hear which enrollment and capacity information you're seeking, and the audio cut out.
I'm sorry. Who knows what's going on here? I'm just wondering, so like, particularly the middle school level, Judy, just looking for, I want to be able to compare the capacity percentages, I guess, so the utilization rates of other middle schools against the middle schools that we're looking at.
Okay.
It just for reference. And I think I've seen that before, but I can't find it.
Okay. And I don't know, Ethan or Jenny, if you can think of any prior reports that were at the middle school level that went outside of Southeast. If we can't come up with one right now, we'll get that sent off to you. I know you're trying to finish some stuff for tonight, so we're going to try and work and find that for you.
Okay, yeah.
I think that the big baseline document for the whole district had an appendix in the back that had facility utilization numbers for like every building in the district.
Is that where it is, Beth? That's where it's hiding? Okay.
Yeah.
That's like, isn't that like the 1,000-page document or something?
That's the one. I mean,
Okay,
I think like 250, but
I know it's grown in my head over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, great. Then I'll take a look at that tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay. This has been a really good conversation. So just want to keep them coming. Anyone have any other questions, thoughts, ideas, comments you want to put into the room before we ask people to fill out their evaluation forms or their, yeah. Yeah. Director Edwards. Yeah.
Just some reflections, and reflections based on 25 years of experience either with consolidations or school closures or boundary changes and the impacts they have on communities. And I guess what I've seen as the disproportionate impact of those actions on sort of the most vulnerable communities. And I really appreciate everybody's thoughtfulness. I think, the spirit of how do we uplift all the kids is very much present. I will say that it gives me real pause, the closing of the Lent neighborhood program, because I've been on the board during periods of time in which other neighborhood programs have been closed, and the schools are then only open for the program, for the programmatic or the program that's left there, whether it was the JMP program at Richmond when the Richmond neighborhood school program closed, or Brooklyn neighborhood school closed, so that Winter Haven could have that building. And the impacts on the neighborhood, and I'm concerned about Lent because if you look across the city, outer Southeast and North Portland have the lowest family incomes. And so it seems like we're potentially going to be closing a neighborhood program in a community in which may be challenging for parents to get their kids to another school. Maybe not be able to walk. The whole thing about, older siblings taking care of younger siblings, just the challenges. There's nothing harder than living across the street from a school and not being able to go. And I know that the proposal is that neighborhood kids can enroll in it. But I think what we find in many schools that you have students, because of housing prices and their families moving, they're entering a school community, not a kindergarten, but in second or third grade. And really, if there's not an option to move into an immersion program at a later grade, that really closes off the opportunity to go to a school that's in the neighborhood. Also, it's just not for all kids. It's not the right fit, and if they're in the neighborhood. So I just, being thoughtful about what that means to a very vulnerable neighborhood community, and what sort of supports, if that decision is made to do that, what sort of supports those families are going to get, so that it is, they're not just like the end of the musical chairs, the ones without the chairs, because families do need a lot of supports that I've seen when things like this happen. So I guess that would be the one I say. I think the spirit of the conversation about elevating the experiences for all students has been so positive, and I'm really proud of the parents and PPS staff that are participating in this, because I think it's the right spirit. I can't, it's sort of like, how could we end up with one of our most vulnerable school communities being sort of losing fully their facility and what they probably perceive as their community. So just I hope that we can figure out a good solve for those families.
Thank you, Director Brim-Edwards. We've got a couple more comments, and then I want to kind of lead back to where Dee was saying, for those of you that think there's value in doing some of the smaller group breakout to maybe help you kind of just do some brainstorming amongst just a couple other people, what we'll do is, we'll try and maybe wrap this up here in the next 15-20 minutes as a large conversation, and then we'll let you all, we will stick around, and anyone that wants to stay and go into small groups to have some smaller conversations to wrestle through some of the filling out of the evaluation form can stick around. And those of you that want to use the time to go in and fill out your forms can do that as well. That being said, let's see, Carrie, we haven't heard a lot from each. I want you in the out loud room.
Well, I want to just acknowledge what Director Brim-Edwards said, and I feel, I know that I am stepping in from like not having been a part of your community this whole time, and so maybe it's not, I don't know, I don't want to make anybody feel like I'm just sort of throwing stuff out here at the last minute and that's not welcome. But I want to acknowledge just the value of neighborhood programs, and like Brim-Edwards says, these DLI programs and immersion programs or other focus option programs, they are not like a one size fits all for all kids. And neighborhood programs are, they are always open to any kid with special needs, any kid who, moves in down the street, who has like speech problems or needs speech support, is dyslexic, all of those things. Like we pull all of the resources that we have to support those students in neighborhood programs. And then I have to just point out that I'm not anti DLI or focus option programs, but I do want to say that we're spending a lot of our airtime is taken up talking about programs here that impact an absolute small minority of the total number of kids in Portland Public Schools. And when we're talking about race and equity and social justice, and we're focusing on this just tiny fraction of kids, and we're letting, right now you look in the papers and our numbers for Black and brown kids, graduating rates, all that stuff are slipping through the cracks. And here we are taking up all this time. And I feel like, and we're talking about a neighborhood program like Lent, and pushing the neighborhood kids out, or saying, well, you can come if you fit into this category of this works for you, and you can come here, and I'll just say that the same thing is happening at Bridger. And it's too late, I suppose, for there to be really anything done about that. But I do feel like I just want to say that. And I also want to say that having followed this along and noted that the data that's been presented by PPS all along has stated that co-located programs are detrimental for the Black and brown students that go there. And I just have to point out that when I saw these proposals, and I see that we're leaving Atkinson and we're leaving Woodstock as they were originally, that just seems like it defeats the purpose that I saw at the very beginning of this whole process. And it's thoroughly disappointing from my perspective to see that, and it's important to point out that Atkinson and Woodstock are in affluent neighborhoods, and it's not like saying you're a bad person if you go to Atkinson or you are advocating for your program there, but I think that we need to point out that we're talking about Lent being impacted in a really big way, and leaving Atkinson and leaving Woodstock as is. And it's from my perspective, it's hard to see that and not feel like that's privilege at work. And that's all I have to say. And I appreciate all of the time and effort that you all have done here, put in here.
Thank you, Carrie. I see hands up, but I want to go to Ellie because she hasn't had a chance to speak tonight. So I want to get your voice in the room.
I think I just kind of want to say what Carrie was just saying, which is that, we have so many neighborhood students and neighborhood programs here that are really being affected. We're talking about split feeders now into middle schools. There's just so many changes and sacrifices that are going to have to be made, to keep Spanish at Kellogg. And I just want to be sure that if that's the direction we're going here, that really is coming from a place of it being best for the whole picture. I want to make sure that it's not because it's the most convenient solution for PPS right now. We heard it pretty strongly at our last meeting that it was going to be too difficult and too inconvenient to rebuild that program. Well, that's putting the burden on the students. That's putting the burden on the neighborhood students who are being displaced. And so I want to make sure that that's not coming from PPS just wanting to do the easiest thing for PPS. I also really want to be sure that PPS doesn't make their overall decision based on which schools are able to have the loudest voices in this process. Some schools do have loud voices because they're more organized. Their parents have more resources. They have PTAs. And we really need to think about the schools that don't have that. The lower SES schools. My school, Marysville, we don't have organized parents. We have a high BIPOC population and a low SES population. And we're not going to be able to get our BIPOC parents to speak out at these meetings and do surveys and write emails. But that doesn't mean that they're not there. And that's really really bothering me to think that in the end, it might be the schools that have the loudest, most organized parent populations that really get their needs met here.
Thank you. All right. I feel like I've been keeping Beth and Eddie waiting a long time, and now we're kind of cycling back around. So go ahead, Beth. Your hand was up first.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. I just so the question that I have is about what was presented tonight and what sort of the focus of the document we're supposed to fill out tonight is on sort of F1, 2, and 3. I'm still in a place where suggesting, as I've already mentioned, further looks at E2 seems viable to me. But what I want to also consider is, are any of these F options better on balance than what was presented in E1 originally? The F1 options are not addressing the concerns that I had with E1 in the first place around enrollment at Harrison Park. Only one of them deals with the high enrollment at Kellogg, and in order to deal with that, it splits the Arleta boundary, which I don't like.
I hear you. Yeah,
so I just want to also be thinking about, like, are any of these a move in the right direction from E1 to begin with?
Right. I'll let Ethan respond to that, because I think that's an important question.
Yeah, I mean, the question about program placements, and there are definitely things that you could do where you have Harrison Park containing all of Spanish immersion and changing around Atkinson. I think you then have to start considering where Lent goes. So we've kind of shown certain viable, those options being viable. And then we've also seems to have heard plenty of opportunity for success of Spanish immersion at Kellogg.
Yeah, so I think the question that she's asking specifically, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Beth, is like, from a baseline standpoint, right? Like, are you starting, is F1 through 3, are any of them making a greater impact on the racial equity impact measures than where you start at E2? Is that right, Beth? Is that kind of where you're starting? Ish.
At E1.
Or at E1, sorry.
Yeah.
Let me pull up the racial equity impact measures for E1, and then I can.
Okay, why don't you do that on the background, and then I'll get some other voices into the room. Thanks, Ethan.
And,
All right,
can I just chime in here quick, Karina, just to acknowledge that part of the F objective was to not only look at options for reducing the enrollment of Kellogg, but also Selwood and Lane, because there had been a lot of conversation about that. So, Judy, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think these were in response to feedback that we got, rolling back some of the boundary changes, also wanting to try not to leave Lane or Selwood out of the conversation, one option for Kellogg. But I think building off of these with earlier considerations is definitely still kind of the input, because now we're seeing the implications of, now what do we need to do to potentially balance Kellogg? That could mean a split the elementary, and based on earlier workshops that we had this week, that's not really something that people want to, at least what we heard from those small sessions, people had a lot of angst about that. So I think building off of the pieces that we've all been looking at for however long this is has been going on, I think are all viable options for us to consider. We just need that direction.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, and kind of build off of that, looking at the racial equity impact measures for E1, we're seeing 62.9% of students total in middle schools above 500 in E1, and that number is 61.4 in draft proposal F1. So And then that increases for F2 with the split feeder. So by lowering Kellogg's enrollment, we are moving that line a little bit more equally, but not necessarily dramatically.
Thanks, Ethan. Dr. O, do you want to speak to something? Yeah, in particular, and then we'll get to the other question.
Yes, I did. I just wanted to remind our participants that we continue to try to reach out to our communities and to our members who don't necessarily, our stakeholders rather, who won't necessarily come to the table. We've asked our principals, and many of them have had coffee chats and alternate forums for these parents and stakeholders to be able to advocate and to be able to communicate. So we are trying to the best of our ability to ensure that the loud voices aren't the only ones that are heard. So if that should give people some peace around it. We're doing our due diligence, and if there's more that we can do, we'll be more than happy to engage as well. Shanice has been in the forefront of our community engagement work, and she's constantly reaching out, and so are our schools and our principals. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Eddie.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I have just two things to say. I just want to, I guess, first make a little bit of space for the importance of Spanish DLI. I mean, before I was a full-time SEGC rep, I was an educator like for 2 decades. And, you know, I've taught in large numbers of Spanish-speaking areas, and, you know, that language barrier is very real. It's a very big issue. And having SDLI, Spanish immersion, is, you know, such an important service. You know, I can't speak enough to it. That, you know, also, you know, I'm also really appreciative. I mean, I think we lose focus sometimes where people bash PPS because it's habit. But, you know, I'm really super personally appreciative that PPS offers immersion programs. I mean, it's such an amazing thing, that it's such an amazing move, and you didn't have to do it, but they did it. That being said, no, this is completely different. So the topic number 2, I also want to put attention on something else, especially feeding off of what Carrie and Ellie were talking about, and trying to center, especially those areas that are of lower SES and have more struggles. One thing also to consider is, I want to just kind of put it out there, is split feeders. And that's part of the reason why I did not want to support F2. But also in general, looking at the issue of Harrison Park, for example. So like, I understand split feeders at the elementary level, especially if there's an immersion program, because, you know, elementary kids kind of stay 100% in their immersion program all day long. So there's not as much time to commingle with the neighborhood kids. So that split feeder kind of makes sense to me. But at the middle school level, the immersion programs are more integrated with the rest of the student body. And so as we're thinking about this, and I know the high school process is going to happen some other time, and it's going to be a whole bag of issues there too. I don't envy anybody. But like, something to think about is like, when we have Harrison Park and you have like Atkinson moving in, and you have you know, Vestal and Bridger, you know, it seems a little bit disparate. And when we're talking about high school feeders, you know, we have the issue of Franklin being way over enrolled, and so you can't move them all to Franklin. So we're talking about definitely a split feeder at Harrison Park. I mean, we're asking these kids to split feeder once at elementary school and then again at middle school, and I don't know, that just seems like, again, we're putting a lot of burden on, you know, the outer southeast of people who we should be centering. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. D.
Sorry, Karina.
No worries.
I put something in the chat, and I meant to actually say it instead of send it. So I just feel like it has to be said. I just have to absolutely disagree. Like, it's not a tiny fraction of kids we're talking about. If you go through the numbers of the BIPOC populations in the schools, like Lentz, Arleta, Marysville, and Bridger, I mean, it's close to 30% in the school, over 50% at Harrison Park. So it's just hurtful to hear people from predominantly white communities sort of characterize it as, oh, there's just not that many BIPOC people in Portland. There's lots of them. They're a small percentage of the overall population, and they're concentrated in these like poorer outlying areas, and sort of fighting for scraps of like good programming. That's what it feels like. And the reason we talk about these programs so much in this conversation is because they do serve a large number of students in the communities. And I absolutely agree that they don't serve Black and Indigenous students in this process. And this process should have started with Black and Indigenous students and talking about what served them best, because there aren't any programs for these students. So there's nothing to sort of like rally around or to develop or to figure out how to make that better. But just like trying to dismantle these DLI programs, like for the sake of the fact that these other students aren't getting talked about or the resources that they need enough, just makes no sense to me. It's like you can't dismantle programs that serve Latinx and Asian students. And we just have to do better about prioritizing BIPOC students, even though there are low numbers. And I just, and this idea of the fact that that the DLI programs take away from the neighborhood, like if you live in a neighborhood and you choose a DLI program for your child, that does not mean that you are no longer a member of that neighborhood. And that just seems to be sort of like this accepted, like it's just, if you're a Latinx person or a Chinese person, you live in the community and you choose a DLI program, and then somebody in your neighborhood who is not BIPOC chooses that program, you're still in the neighborhood and you're still neighbors and you're still part of that community. And so that division is just really frustrating to me, because it just makes it feel like, it just makes me feel like we can demand, when BIPOC communities want to see equal programming, it's not okay unless every single non-BIPOC family is getting the exact same quality and access to programming. And BIPOC families don't get to demand that from other programs that are closer in. We can't go into a school in Laurelhurst or into a school on the west side and say, we want the same amount of programming. The answer is always, well, you don't live here. And, I find that whole line of reasoning to just be really frustrating, as it's like you can be in the neighborhood and then you're just not in the neighborhood just because you choose this program.
Sandra.
All right, I'm at home and on my Wi-Fi, so
you're good to go. Sounding clear as a bell.
So I think what I have to say probably relates back to more what Ellie and folks were saying, and that would be essentially when we process, we started with a charge, and we started, with the idea that we are supposed to be focusing around J Lentz, and that our charge was to properly enroll and open Harrison Park and Lane schools. And in the meantime, we have devoted an incredible amount of our time to the conversation centering the DLI program and where to put those programs, which I understand we needed to an extent, because getting those programmatic changes in place allow us to look at other things. I am just confused at how it feels like at this point, looking at these F proposals, that it felt like, despite the fact that we had some hiccups and a little bit of what felt like backtracking to me, it felt like we were making good progress. And now we're in a position where we have Lent as a whole school DLI, despite the fact that Lent has expressed that that is not what they wanted, which is why I had asked to see a deep dive of who we got that feedback from recently, because we've heard over and over that they did not want a whole school DLI, that they wanted a general education program, or whatever name we want to call that program that's not a neighborhood program that more aptly describes it without making our DLI students feel othered, because I recognize that that is a necessity. And I appreciate that Dee has brought that to the forefront. We have the Bridger School, who said they didn't want to see their strands separated, and weren't necessarily, looking at a whole DLI as the option that they wanted. We have Atkinson, who has a weird boundary that we're going to have to do all kinds of acrobatics to touch the school that would become their middle school. And they're remaining a co-located program. And I understand that that co-located program is a successful program, but it kind of feels like the rules and guidelines have shifted rapidly and repeatedly. At the beginning of this process, we were told that Marysville and Arleta schools were the only two schools that we were looking at that were actually projected to grow in enrollment over the next 5 years. However, in order to balance out these numbers on paper for our middle schools, we're now looking at an F2 proposal that swaps out 44 students at Marysville, sends 64 students from Arleta to 4 other schools, splits a feeder, while largely changing 2 school communities. And we're told that we're doing this because we might have a problem staffing the Spanish CLI program if we move it from Kellogg. And as Eddie pointed out, we weren't really giving concrete information. Are we losing teachers? Could we lose admin? How much might come over? How many people are going to remain at Harrison Park when it's changed? Additionally, we're told we're doing this because we don't want to over-enroll Kellogg. We were happy to over-enroll Kellogg and have Creston there. But when we are talking about over-enrollment, we're talking about a 92%. But somehow, I'm supposed to send my child next year to a school, an elementary school that's at 106% that we weren't even allowed to look at. So on one hand, we have Kellogg, where it's absolutely a huge problem if they're at 92%. But elementary schools and other schools we're not allowed to touch in affluent neighborhoods can remain grossly over-enrolled, and that is somehow okay. So there's a lot of information here that conflicts and does not make sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to me. Frankly, you guys, I am so dang tired right now. You know, from Halloween on, it has been one fire drill after another for the Arleta community. And I am exhausted. This has become a part-time job for a lot of us, and I am frustrated, and I need to express that. And I appreciate you allowing me to do so, because it is so hard that we are not allowed to touch these schools that are so affluent, that are somehow okay to be at 106%, but then we are supposed to do incredible acrobatics and it put in place changes that our most vulnerable communities have said that they absolutely do not want. And I guess I will leave it at that for tonight, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Thank you for bringing the passion and the importance of awareness of the impact of that to your community. So thank you for that. Carrie, you've got your hand up. I just want to be sure that I don't want this to turn into a DLI versus neighborhood schools, thing back and forth. So if you have issues or questions or points to make that are outside of that, then I welcome that. Otherwise, I think it might be good for us to go into our small groups and see if we can't make some headway in helping to fill that out. So I want to offer you that first, Carrie, before we do that. But do you want to try and I think different people are coming at this from different perspectives, but it feels like we can go around and around in this, and I'm not sure that we're moving the conversation forward. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. I appreciate that. But I do want to clarify, because I feel like something that I said was
misconstrued or
yeah, exactly. I just want to make sure that it's clear that I wasn't, when I said this is a small minority of students that we're talking about, what I mean is the percentage of students who go to DLI, who are enrolled in DLI programs in PPS as a whole, compared to the total number of students at PPS.
Yeah, you weren't looking at a particular school community.
No, not at all. And I do think that it's the majority of BIPOC students in PPS, I believe I can safely say this, are not enrolled in DLI programs. And I think that's the point that I was trying to make. And so I'm not specifically calling out any program there. I do think that if we're talking about RESJ or like racial equity and social justice, it's not the DLI programs do not embody that at PPS. Our whole school district is what we need to be looking at, and we can't say DLI programs I mean, I think that to say that, especially when you look at the percentage of students, you know, like native English speakers and whatever who are enrolled in DLI programs. And I don't want to get into the back and forth like you said, but I do want to underscore that what I meant was that the majority of our BIPOC students are not enrolled in DLI programs. And if we mistake that, then you know, it's true that Creston is a majority white school, but 27% of our students are not white. And a lot of schools, Marysville, Arletta, same thing. And we need to not like sort of assume that we're, by speaking up, we're not or saying anything about like where DLI, about those programs. I don't mean, anyway, I think I said what I need to say. I'm just going to talk myself into
appreciate
that.
I mean, I appreciate the complexity of it, right? Because it does feel like we have had, I think to Sandra's point, we've had conversations in September that do feel like it has been DLI versus neighborhood, right? And so I understand what you're saying. And I guess maybe the way that I would close is that it's not an either or, it's an and, right? If you want to solve the Res J problem, you got to solve it for the DLI, the kids in DLI programs and the kids in neighborhood programs. It's not an either or.
And as I know you're getting to closure, Karina, and I just want to go on the record and say, dual language immersion is a very important racial equity, social justice, instructional strategy in PPS.
Yes,
it is what we believe is going to help us improve achievement, outcomes, and success for many children that we don't serve well now. And we need to do it better. And we've been going round and round for that purpose and not at the expense of neighborhood. I believe that. I just needed that I just wanted to make sure that it's a strategy we believe in because it serves kids well. And it is part of our racial equity and social justice strategy. Thank you for letting me say that.
Yeah, no, that's an important, thank you for bringing that into the room, Judy. That's important. Okay, so yes, I see your question in there, Michelle, and I do want to answer that question before we go into small groups because some people may choose not to go into small groups and may choose to leave, but maybe Judy, I don't know if this is a question for you or for Claire, but can one of you speak to what happens after the board votes on the recommendation from our group? Are there tweaks that can be made at that point, or do the tweaks come kind of as it's being moved into a board decision?
I'm not sure if Claire's available right now. I can.
Oh,
are you
there she
there,
goes.
Yeah.
It's taking a minute for it to, you know, if you hit it twice, you're in trouble.
You're going back and forth. You're cycling. Did you get the question though, Claire?
Yes.
Okay.
And so it is meant, the process is meant to have an opportunity for the Southeast Guiding Coalition bring forward their best thinking. It comes to me. I'll review it with staff so we can make sure there aren't any hiccups, unanticipated hiccups, right? As we come forward and making sure it's a complete proposal. Like, did it leave an unanswered question about a specific school and the shifting that's happening in that school? So we'll want to make sure that that's all solid. And it's also, we need to hear, then I would take that final proposal forward, and then the board needs to approve it. And so we have the work session with them next week. Then we bring it to them after you're done on the 17th. I take it to them on March 1st. They have one more discussion, and then on the 15th, they would approve. So that's in terms. So it's meant to be changed as we go along, and be complete on the 15th. So then we can work with all the processes that we need to do to implement.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Nathan, I think, has been trying to get us set up into trios, at least the SCGC members. So thank you. First of all, if some of you choose not to stay with us and not go into small groups, to just kind of hash it out for maybe the next 20 minutes. thank you for joining us. We do try, Megan, will you put the link to the evaluation form that folks are supposed to fill out, just so that people have that at the ready in the chat? Thank you so much. You know, we definitely feel the whack-a-mole part of this. So thank you for being here, and we'll push you into small groups and then come back together and figure out what our next steps are.
Recording in progress.
Oh, thank you, Gail. Always keeping us recorded. Thank you for those of you who stuck with us tonight. Hopefully you had some fruitful discussions in your small group rooms. Want to talk a little bit about next steps, because we're hoping that really at this point we need your thoughts on paper, right? So we need, or I don't know, in the ether, we need you filling out the forms. So the goal is to have those completed by all SCGC members and principal reps by first thing tomorrow morning. The district will compile them and disseminate them to the group as quickly as possible. So that way everyone has access to those. We're also going to make the recording for this session available to the rest of the SCGC members, because there was a lot of good information provided. So that was a good suggestion. And then the other thing that we're going to look to do is set up more, and I don't want to say coffee chats or work sessions between now and next Thursday. The hope is that we reach, you know, the charter indicated that if we can't get to consensus, you know, then we go with majority, right? And so trying to figure out where we will end up and what proposal we move forward with in terms of program placement to allow us to then move into boundary conversations is the important next step. So yeah, I think that, so keep an eye out. Obviously, you will hear from probably Megan about when the information will be available to you, and when, if any, there are meetings for the group to come together in coffee chats or in work sessions before Thursday. Want to remind people that there is a board work session to wrestle with this on Tuesday night, the 15th. And SCGC chairs and district reps will be there. And I will leave it to you to close us for the night, Dr. O.
All right. Again, I do want to thank you all for your commitment to this process. It has been incredibly time-consuming, very challenging, and highly emotional, but you've maintained professionalism through it all. You've surfaced ideas that we probably would not have noticed, and you've been willing to have the hard conversations. Whatever happens, we know that you were fully committed, you were all present, and that you did the very best that you can in the interest of our children. I just want to remind you again to please complete your feedback form. It helps us plan upcoming meetings. To please continue to chime or send your ideas to us. And I do want to wish you a safe travel home if you're not home. And if you're home, have a restful night. And we will see you hopefully on Tuesday. To our team, I cannot thank you enough. Karina and Claire and Judy and Mani and the rest of the team. Thank you so much for
Jet Analytics.
For JED Analytics, right? I want to call him Flo. Thank you so much for a pleasant evening and, you know, a fun time having all these discussions. Have a great night.
A wonderful night, everyone.
Recording